I'm Carrie Davenport, a Pioneer rep from Owen Sound, and you're listening to the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast.
Thanks, Carrie, and thank you for listening to the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. My name's Andrew Campbell, and we're excited for our second season of the show with a great lineup of guests over the next several weeks covering issues from rootworm and soybean cyst nematodes to trait integration and BMR corn. For today's show, though, we're going to step out of the fields and into the world of agriculture policy. After all, issues like business risk management programming and agriculture literacy are just as critical to the long-term success of Ontario's grain industry as getting a good crop off. With that in mind, I think we're really going to start this season off with a bang as we talk to Corteva Canada's President Bryce Eger, as well as Ontario's Minister of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, Lisa Thompson. Now, in a perfect world, I actually would have got to meet them in person for this interview, but the federal election call shoved plans for the federal, provincial, territorial ministers meeting later in the fall. But with that as the backdrop for our conversation, I want to bring in Lisa Thompson. She is OMAFRA's minister, as well as the MPP for the very agriculture area of Huron-Bruce. She served several other roles around the cabinet table, including Minister of Government and Consumer Services, as well as Minister of Education. Minister, thanks for joining us today. I want to start with the ministers' meeting that you are going to host in Guelph, because I think a lot of the listeners to the podcast are growing grain, and a topic that comes up with them nearly every time these meetings are held is business risk management programming, especially making sure they are responsive when farmers need it. Can you tell us where the negotiations are at and what your priorities are making sure this deal actually gets done?
First of all, I want to recognize that farmers in Ontario and across Canada, we recognize that it's a very unique working environment. Farmers deal with a lot of risks, if you will, beyond their control. And honestly, they need programs that bring certainty to their work environment, and programs are needed to ensure that we have farmers continuing to invest and innovate in this industry as well. And so we're working very, very well, I should say, with both the federal level and our jurisdictions across Canada to keep talking about how do we be better? How do we continue to ensure that farmers have that certainty and predictability? And so one thing that we did in Ontario, and I give recognition and kudos to Ernie Hardiman. He worked very, very hard in, representing a rural riding in Ontario. I stood right beside him when we were able to add $50 million to the Ontario Risk Management Program a year ahead of schedule to help give farmers more peace of mind and that predictability that I spoke about. And then the nice thing about that program and the enhancements that Ernie introduced was that if it should happen that it was a good year, we're able now to roll any unused funds over into the next year, so that we're pooling in the event that there's a catastrophic year and farmers across the province need help. So we're being very thoughtful, Andrew, in how we move forward. And I'd just like to take a moment to thank Ernie and all the amazing work that he did to get us to this point.
Now, obviously, the risk management program is one of the keys that I know grain farmers have pushed hard over the last many, many years. Maybe still not the investment coming in from the federal government that Ontario would like. The other piece of this is agri-stability and making some modifications that the prairie provinces have been a little slow to agree with, at least what Ontario agrees to. Do you think an agreement can actually happen by the time the FPT meeting comes around later this year?
Well, I can tell you, I've already worked very closely with my colleagues across Canada with regards to the drought situation that we have on our hands as well. And I'm very pleased to share with everyone listening today that we were all able to work together across Canada to remove the reference margin limit for agri-stability, but we couldn't get enough provinces to agree on the compensation rate. So in Ontario, we had the support of the Premier and Cabinet to be able to go ahead on our own to provide that additional protection to our farmers. And I want to share with everyone that we're going to continue to work with our agricultural colleagues across Canada to determine how can we best move forward together. Because again, there is the federal government put the stipulation out that they'd only come to the table if 70% of the provinces and 70% of the farmers in the program represented are there ready to talk about how do we move forward with enhanced supports. So we need to work and continue discussing the upcoming FPT meeting. Certainly we'll have this on the agenda. And, I'm pleased to say that our provinces worked really well together in coming forward in an ag recovery perspective to bring the feds to the table to help manage the impact of the drought in Ontario, particularly Northern Ontario. But that is an example of where we were able to work quickly together for a satisfactory outcome.
Well, and certainly that is the case because, it kind of took over and became the dominant issue that obviously all of you kind of had to figure out, just given the severity of it in the Prairie provinces and obviously Northern Ontario too. One of the other items on the agenda, though, that, I just kind of piqued my interest was the working group on retail fees, because I think there's more and more of a realization, maybe not at the primary production level, but as we get through further processing, that something needs to be done with some of these retail fees that some of the big players are imposing at the grocery level. Do you think there can be agreement in what to do with something like that? Or what does that working group, what do you hope that working group comes up with?
Well, I can tell you there's an absolute certain agreement that something needs to be done and that we need to be talking about this with all the partners at the table to have a pan-Canada approach to a code of ethics that will enable, again, certainty for all of our farmers as well as partners in the value chain that feed grocery stores across Canada. And, the pandemic, if you will, really exacerbated the whole situation and shone a spotlight that on the situation whereby everybody recognizes the discussions need to be had. People need to be sincere because I've mentioned it my entire career. I get frustrated when people just assume farmers at one end of the value chain have to be price takers. I feel very strongly that we need to keep dialogue going so that we can, have a fair representation and no one partner's taking advantage of the other.
Now, if I can step away from FPT discussions for, a little bit here now, one of the things, I mean, we're recording this ahead of a federal election, even though we're going to release it after a federal election. We don't really know what's going to end up. But clearly one of the priorities at the federal level is climate policy. And I think that goes no matter which government comes into play. I'm curious, from OMAFRA's standpoint, what role do you think, or what priorities do you have that can help farmers, not only adapt to climate change, but obviously take advantage of some of the programs that could be coming down the road to actually help them make investments on their farm?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And you're right. We're all mindful of the weather events that happened just this past week in Midwestern Ontario. We had severe weather that saw a lot of hail damage in our crops. And I'm very pleased, Andrew, to share, though, in Ontario, we're really committed to making sure that we have the right programming. For instance, like LEADS, the Lake Erie Agriculture Demonstrating Sustainability, that's working well. And we have our annual intake for farmers through the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, of which I might say the intakes are opening in the next couple of months for the next round. But we just had an innovation summit earlier this week in Ontario. And I am absolutely buoyed at the commitment and the vision and the willingness of industry and researchers and farmers wanting to be at the table to look at how can we be better, how can we work closely on sustainability. And so it's a combination. I feel that we need to have the right research with the right innovators working to demonstrate the value to farmers. And the discussions this past week really give me reason to be confident in saying that Ontario is going to continue to lead the way when it comes to farm sustainability.
Now, this is the Pioneer podcast. Pioneer's owned by Corteva. Among that kind of misunderstanding that you hear from the consumer side is obviously the things that Corteva produces. We're talking pesticides, we're talking GMOs, we're talking things in modern agriculture that I think more and more people at least have concern with. I'm curious, as a Minister of Agriculture, I mean, you hear lots of different sides for what government should and shouldn't do. How do you balance that between, what modern agriculture is today, what it could be, and the concerns you might hear from non-farm folks?
Well, again, first things first, I recognize and applaud the agricultural industry for the innovation and the advancement in practices that farmers use day in and day out. The 4Rs is a perfect example of how precision agriculture is really making a difference. And Corteva, Pioneer are perfect examples of businesses that are cutting edge. And we need to be pursuing science and real life applications to become better as well. And so again, it comes down to communication and being very proud to be in the agri-food industry and addressing these questions and practices in a very transparent, open manner so that people can understand that food security is a very significant responsibility. And in order to achieve food security, people should be celebrating that today we are producing more food on less acres because of innovation and science and advancement in agricultural practices. And that should be celebrated.
Do you think it's easier to celebrate today, given so many conversations now we have about science literacy and, around the conversation of vaccinations and COVID and all of that? I mean, I've certainly seen more and more in mainstream media and lots of sectors talk about science is so important. I'm waiting for them to also cheer GMOs. I haven't heard that yet, but I am curious. I mean, does it become easier to maybe celebrate or at least sell that celebration, given that people are more hyper aware of, science literacy and the need for it?
That's an interesting perspective. And again, I think it's really important that it starts in our schools. And students need to have the proper introduction to how science is making a difference and advancing all industries and ways of lives. And we need to start at that level and then make it relevant. And, it's interesting. I don't know about your hometown, but when I go grocery shopping and I hear other people talking about it as well, shelves aren't stocked like they used to be. And, look at British Columbia. Their tender fruit product literally went up in smoke with the fires in that province. Unfortunately, their tender fruit industry was really impacted. But here in Niagara area in Ontario, we've had a bumper crop. And so we've been able to supplement that need in British Columbia with our locally Ontario grown tender fruit. And so we need to continue to drive messaging at all levels in terms of why science and why best practices matter, and most importantly, celebrate how best practices are embraced by farmers and ultimately making a difference.
Celebrating that fact sounds like a great place to end our conversation. Minister, thanks very much for joining the podcast today.
Thank you, Andrew.
Next, we take the conversation to Calgary and catch up with Bryce Eger, the president of Corteva Agrisciences here in Canada. And while he calls Calgary home today, He's spent much of his career in Ontario, having titles such as Sales Manager, Operations Director, Business Director, as well as serving as president of the former Pioneer Hybrid Canada company. Bryce, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Hey, good morning to you, Andrew. Hopefully things are good out in southwestern Ontario.
Things are always good in southwestern Ontario. It's God's country, Bryce.
Yeah,
that's
right.
Where we
that's
are
right.
out here. I want to get started, Bryce, and kind of go with where we just left off with the minister, and that is the idea about how do we combat misinformation, how do we build confidence in modern ag technology, how do we do all that, given kind of this information or this misinformation age we seem to be in. And I kind of want to start, obviously you're leading Corteva Canada and, kind of can see a lot of these conversations that go on. Do you think we're in a better spot? Are people more confident today than maybe they were a few years ago? Or is this, we're just kind of spinning our tires?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I believe that what we've seen through COVID has been belief in the food system and modern agriculture, and the agricultural system in general has improved. And I think that the fact that we've been able to supply food across Canada in particular, so starting there, and continue to make sure that the grocery stores, the grocery shelves were full, and make sure that the produce sections were full, is a testament to the fact that modern agriculture and what we're doing is working. And I do believe that that's recognized by consumers. There wasn't a run on a lot of grocery store items aside from toilet paper early days of COVID. And I think that there is a belief that we are turning the corner somewhat around what the consumer believes today's modern farmer is actually doing, which is working really, really hard to produce healthy, nutritious, affordable food. So I believe we made some improvement, but I also think we have a long way to go ultimately to be able to get, I'd say, a larger percentage of the population believing that what we're doing in agriculture is the right thing.
Now, the minister, we talked to her about, what she feels the government's role in building that confidence is. What's the role for a company like Corteva?
Well, I think they converge openly, Andrew. When I think of government's role and industry's role, our focus is on helping farmers to make sure that they can provide for all of us as consumers, and every one of us, including all of our farm customers, are consumers themselves. But in order to do that, our role is to make sure that we're really, really focused on new innovations, providing ways to protect the crop and ensure that there is production off the land that we have. What goes hand in hand with that is the ability to work with the policy agencies within the government and ensure that we actually are able to bring those innovations to the market. So ultimately, it's about working collectively between industry and government to drive the regulatory policy of new technologies in both public and private sectors, right? There is space and ample space for a large number of players to be able to provide those technologies to the farm. And then the other part of it, to bridge around the consumer, is we also need to make sure that we're working really, really hard, I'll say hand in hand, around the acceptance and utilization of those technologies. So making sure that not only the policy and the regulatory environment enables it, but also the education system, outreach programs into the general population are also really, really strong, so that we don't miss a step as we think about being able to innovate for not only the near term but the long term. That's ultimately where I think the convergence of industry and government comes together. And there's a really good story to be told as we continue to build that out.
Now, you mentioned kind of that link between obviously COVID today too, and it's one that certainly I think a lot of us have made when you talk about consumer acceptance, science literacy, all of that type of stuff. But we've obviously also seen the other side, and consumers, and if I think of COVID specifically, you think of protests and you think of kind of outrage that goes along with that new technology. Is there an easy way to counter that as industry, or is it just about, kind of continuing to push that message as you've been trying to do for the last several years?
I think collectively as an industry, we need to continue with a lot of the grassroots work that we're doing, whether it's through Ag in the Classroom, initiatives, working with 4-H. All of those are really, really important, and I think they're foundational. On top of that, I do believe that as an industry, we have to continue to be a little more bold, and find new and innovative ways to be able to connect with consumers and tell the story. And I think that, there's a number of different, associations and places that's happening. I think the work that goes on, whether it's the Center for Food Integrity, whether it's through CropLife Canada, I do believe that there is some more, I'll say, humanizing of modern agriculture that's taken place. And I think that we have to continue to amplify that even more, because ultimately it's really trying to provide as much fact as we possibly can, but also tell the story, because we have a legacy of being able to provide across this country and do, I'll say, very, very good things as it pertains to food production. So we should celebrate that, and we need to be able to amplify that message a little bit more, because I think that we're in a spot where we have more and more consumers that are willing to listen, and they're willing to they have time to listen, I guess, is also part of it. But there is a willingness to listen that I think is it's a really interesting time right now, as we're into this generational shift and the consumer preferences that are happening there. So
one of the other conversations that I think that I've been interested to hear from Corteva speak on is the issue of climate change. And it's one that really, since Corteva's birth of 2 and a bit years ago, it's been one of those things that I've seen at meetings, I've seen in literature, I've seen in marketing materials that you've put that as kind of a priority that you think needs focus. Why is that? What do you think the importance of having that conversation is?
Well, I think as I think about Corteva, ourselves as a company, I think that sustainability and climate is embedded in pretty much everything, every decision that we make. And, whether it's the research that we're doing and the research expertise that we have, our product innovation, agronomy support, products and solutions, all of that is really focused on and designed to ensure that, our world's farmers, and in this case, our Canadian farmers, are continuously becoming more productive, profitable, sustainable. And I think that we really look at how do we take what we're doing from breeding technology and modernization and next generation breeding technology, digital agriculture, and how we can have a place to play to help farmers make better decisions around what they're applying where and how we're managing the farm, as well as other product development. So thinking crop protection products, both synthetic as well as biologicals. I think all of that plays into the stewardship message and the climate message that we have as an industry. And the interesting point about this, I guess, from where I stand is farmers have always been the stewards of the land, and they always have wanted to be able to find the most effective, most efficient way of managing that investment that they have in that land asset. And, I think about that a lot as I look at the way that farmers make decisions around the technologies that they're using, why they're continuing to look at ways to be the best stewards that they possibly can. And I think that fits really well, because I think the industry itself has been very, very aware of how to continue to evolve and realign and be agile around what we're doing to be able to make sure that we're being as efficient as we possibly can with the products that we're using across all those acres. Then going hand in hand with that, from our standpoint, the sustainability goals that we've kind of built are really focused on how do we continue to see an increase in crop yields by 20% while while reducing the amount of greenhouse gases by approximately 20% over the course of the next number of years. And that's a big challenge, but it really is an opportunity for us to be able to, as an industry and as an organization, for us to really continue to evolve and I'll say make things even more effective, while again bridging back to the message to the consumer that we are in this to make sure that this is long-term sustainable for everybody, from the farmer all the way through to the consumer and right to the kitchen table. So
I'm glad you brought up that point of connecting with that consumer, because I do think it is one of those things where it's not uncommon to sit and watch a video and see lots of companies brag about their sustainability goals and what they're doing. But it's not necessarily in agriculture. We don't necessarily see that. Well, let's be honest. We as farmers aren't as good at bragging as some other industries. Is there anything, as an industry we can do a better job to talk about those sustainability? Because I agree, like farmers are leaders in this area. Industry is leaders in this area. How do we go about making sure the consumer knows about it?
So I think further to what we were maybe talking about a little bit before, Andrew, around telling the story and making sure that the stories are I'll say easy enough for everybody to understand, and that comes from being able to talk about what's happened with the transition within agriculture, everything from what's happening with minimum and zero till operations, what's happening with cover crop, what's happened with pesticide usage over the period of time, to be able to give everybody outside of agriculture a sense of just how much progress has actually taken place. And I think that that's part of that storytelling that needs to come back, and some of that education that comes back all the way to right to what's being taught in our classrooms, whether it's ag in the classroom or the actual curriculum, as well as broader scale education from support with the government and working and aligning across the industry and with government to make sure that we are telling a consistent message or portraying a consistent message. And I think that is happening in a much better way than it did a number of years ago. We still have a lot of different associations representing agriculture. We have a lot of different, governments, whether it's provincially, municipally, or federally, that are representing agriculture. But I do believe that the core messages are coming to really what we have accomplished, but also being able to tell the story of there also is still work to be done, and nobody is shying away from that. Everybody is very, very open. Everybody that I interact with from an agriculture standpoint, everybody is looking for ways to be able to become more efficient and more effective at what we do as an industry. And that, I think, is an important story to tell.
What a great point to end the conversation on, Bryce. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Stay well.
And that does it for our first episode of this fall season for the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did, we'd really appreciate it if you took the time to rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcast or wherever you happen to be listening. Whenever you do that, it helps other growers and others in the agriculture sector find us. As for our next episode, we are actually going to get out of the studio and into a field. Soybean cyst nematodes and white mold have certainly been issues this growing season. We'll talk about it from both the R&D side as well as the agronomic side next time. On behalf of the entire Pioneer team, thank you so much for listening to the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. Don't forget, you can always get in touch on Twitter at Pioneer Seeds CA or my personal handle, Fresh Air Farmer. And for more info or advice, talk to your local Pioneer rep or visit pioneer.com/Canada.